been having sciatica problems, and I didn't think I could ever come up and stand here, but Tylenol does miracles. So thank God for Tylenol. And I'm finally cooled off. I apologize, all you people that arrived and I was sweating before. My metabolism moves very fast. I again want to thank all of you for coming today. I'm sure there's plenty of things that you would like to have done on this beautiful sunny afternoon, but this makes our event so much more wonderful to be able to share it with all of you. And so many of you have been a part of my life. My 4 or 5 people that are here from the elections, and I've been doing the elections here in the United States with them, and I appreciate you coming. My pharmacist that has been my pharmacist for many years, she was good enough to come. Friends that I hadn't seen for 25 years, like Jay Tyson, everybody. I'm so happy you could all come. I have spent a long time thinking about what I'm going to do, what I'm going to say to you today. I am so glad that the trilogy is finished. In the beginning, I didn't know I was writing a trilogy. When I started in 2019, I had known I had a lot of unbelievable experiences. And I never had time to tell my children and grandchildren anything about them, even when I got back. We'd sit down over a cup of coffee, and in 2 minutes, the kids would have to be taken here or there or anywhere, and I never had time to really share everything that I had done. So I started writing. And in 2019, I went to a publisher, which happened to be my Book Baby publisher, and had them print me 30 books and just put about a dozen stories in that book. And I gave them to my 6 children and my 18 grandchildren and a few of my best friends, and for Christmas. And in January, you can imagine how shocked I was when I opened up my computer and saw a GoFundMe written in my name. And it turned out that my wonderful granddaughters, my 3 granddaughters, had read some of my work in that book and decided I needed to publish my book. And so they literally made it possible for me to publish my first book. And then it was just the second book happened, and the third book is printed, and I'm still worrying about getting it paid for, but it's on its way. That's how it all came about. At first I thought that I would tell you about all the important people that I've met in my life in the last 35 years, because I'm kind of focusing on the last 35 years. My husband passed away when he was 49 and I was 46, and I came back home to New Jersey after 26 years in the cornfields of Indiana, where my 6 children were born. And I did about 3 years of soul searching, walking the Spring Lake and Seeger beaches and boardwalks, until I finally decided I was going to move to a college town and I was going to get involved in international relations and peacemaking. That's how it all started. On my 50th birthday, my children and their future husbands had a beautiful dinner for me, and that was when I announced to them that I was moving to Princeton. And of course, Eileen, who's very diplomatic, says, "Oh, well, that's wonderful, Mom. You're only an hour away. We can come and see you once in a while. And at the same time, we'll have our free time now to ourselves. And you can have your free time back to you." So that was how I moved to Princeton. That was when I started once I took a step in Princeton, my whole life changed. And I thought I would talk about all the important people in my life. So I thought I'd tell you about Hillary Clinton, whom I spent an afternoon with in the Blue Room of the White House. I thought I'd tell you about President Vigdis Finnbogadr, who was the first woman president of Iceland for 16 years. And I met with her in her office for an hour in Reykjavik, Iceland. I thought I'd tell you about Honorable Olja Suleyman Yav, whom I met in Washington, D.C., and when he came through the double doors, it was like, oh, there you are. It's like, we've been supposed to meet for 50 years. And I mean, we just became instant comrades. Or maybe I should have tell you about President Nazarbayev and the First Lady Sarah Nazarbayeva, whom I met with at one time in my life when Bristol Myers gave me a gift to take to a fundraiser that they were holding. And then I thought I'd tell you about Rodrigo Carazo, the former president of Costa Rica, and Robert Mueller, the Honorable Robert Mueller, who was the former Undersecretary General of the United Nations. And I worked with them for 3 days in Costa Rica, and I thought, oh, you'd like to know about all them. But then I started thinking, if I tell you about all these people, you're gonna think I'm politically motivated. And I'm not politically motivated in any way. So I threw that idea out the window. My next idea was to share about all the angels that I've met in my lifetime. I do believe in angels. I do believe God sends people down here to help us through our life. And I know I've met a lot of people that have come in my life and helped me and stepped out of my life. So I thought, well, I'll tell you all about my angels. And then I thought, oh, shoot, then you're gonna think I'm a religious fanatic. I'm not a religious fanatic. So that went out the window. And I was gonna tell you all about my 3 books, but I thought, shit, if I tell you about my 3 books, you're not gonna read them. If you know all about them, but I mean, it would take a long time to tell you 44 stories, and that's what's in those 3 books. So then I thought, what am I gonna talk about today? And then I finally decided something we all relate to. I was gonna tell you about my personal heroes. The people, I've had many heroes in my life, many. But there's 5 or 6 that stand out. And I thought, well, I'll tell you about my heroes. Of course, my first heroes were my mom and dad. Most people have their first heroes be their mom and dad, I imagine. And I had very good parents. Bill and Lois Nicolai were wonderful parents. They gave us a good life. They were middle class to lower middle class in Chatham Township, but they worked hard and they gave us what we needed. And the one thing I credit them with, from the day I was 3 years old on, they drove me every Sunday, my dad did, to Presbyterian Church in Madison, and I went to Sunday school every single Sunday, all the years I was growing up, and I loved Sunday school. And I sang in the children's choir, and I sang in the adult choir. But church was very special to me, and that gave me, I believe, the faith that I have today. So then, my second most important heroes came later in my life, after I had 6 beautiful children, and I raised them, and they were my little people when they were little, and then they grew up, and now they're my best friends. And they became my most important heroes in my life. And I couldn't do anything without my 4 daughters, and I didn't think I would get emotional, but I'm almost emotional, and I don't get emotional easily. But my girls have been my strength. They are the wind beneath my wings, so to speak. And I always tell them they are 4 women of substance. I'm proud of every one of them. So they are my very true heroes. When I moved back home from Indiana after my husband died, and I decided that I was going to move to Princeton, I walked in the first week of December, I walked into Princeton University. I'd never been to Princeton in my life. I had never been to the university, and I'd always heard about it. Everybody in the entire world, people in Russia and Kazakhstan, all knew about Princeton. Everybody does. So I walked in the front door of Princeton University, and I looked at these 2 older ladies that were at the registration desk, and I said, I want to sign up for night classes in international relations. And they kind of looked at each other out of the corner of their eyes, and they looked at me and said, my dear lady, we're an Ivy League school. We don't have night classes here. You're gonna have to go to the community college to go to night classes. I said, well, I wanna get involved here in Princeton in international relations. And is there a peacemaker? Oh, yes. Professor Richard Falk is our best peacemaker here. And he's right here on campus. So they told me how to find the Woodrow Wilson School for Public and International Politics, is what it was called then. The name has changed a little. But anyway, I walked into Professor Falk's office, and June, his sort of secretary for 20-some years, she said, well, I'm sorry, but Professor Falk is now downstairs getting ready to conduct a class. I said, well, can I go down and sit in on his class? And she said, well, there's no rule against it. I've never known of anybody do it, but you probably can. So I went over to the Woodrow Wilson School and went downstairs, and here's this big circular room with classrooms all the way around. And I was amazed when I got in there. I love an intellectual climate anyway. And then I saw where Richard Falk's name was, and I saw these students going in. So I went in, and I asked Professor Falk, I introduced myself, and I said, could I sit in on your class? He said, well, I guess you can. He said, I've never had anybody sit in on my class but my academics, but he said you can. So I sat against the wall and watched 13 students from about 9 countries sit around in a circle with Richard Falk and conduct his class. Oh, it was wonderful. That hour was just wonderful. So after the class was over, I went up and I said, can I talk to you for a little bit? He said, well, I'm sorry, I'm on my way to a faculty meeting and I can't meet with you today, but I'm available Wednesday between 2 and 4 if you want to come and see me. So I said, okay. So the next Wednesday at 2 o'clock, I was there at June's desk, and I said, I'd like to see Professor Falk, and she said, yes, he's back in his office. So I walked back where she told me to go, and oh my God, there were stacks of books from the floor to the ceiling. I had to walk through a maze yelling, Professor Falk, where are you, Professor Falk? And he said, I'm in here. So I finally found him, and I sat down and we spent an hour together. And I loved Professor Falk. He was wonderful. He told me about his life there at Princeton University, and I told him what I was doing and that I wanted to get involved in the peace movement. So he said, well, this is the place to come and you can sit in on all the seminars and everything. I said, well, that's wonderful. Then all I need to do is find a place to live and a job, and I'm gonna move right over here. So he said, well, I'll tell you what, you can move in my house today if you want. I said, what? He said, yes, I'm getting ready to go to Israel to testify in a trial, and I'll be gone about 3 weeks over our Christmas break. So he said, you can have my house. And he said, I'm right on Prospect Street. That was like 2 blocks. He lived 2 blocks from the Woodrow Wilson School. And he said, you're very welcome to move in whenever you want and stay as long as you want. I said, well, that's wonderful. So I got up to leave, and as I'm getting up to leave and turn, he said, oh, Ms. Nicolai, just a minute. He said, you know, I have a 16-year-old son, Noah, and he doesn't want to go to Israel with me this time. He said, would you mind keeping an eye out? Well, I had forgotten what a 16-year-old can do in 2 weeks. So I said, of course I will. I mean, my God, I was going to get to stay there, so I didn't have any idea what Noah might do. Well, Richard went to Israel. I have a picture of Brenda in front of Richard's bookcase. He had bookcases on every wall. He didn't have wallpaper. He didn't have painted walls. He had bookcases, and he must have had 100,000 books in his 3-story house. He had bookcases in his bathroom. I mean, you didn't think about watching TV. You just pulled out a book, no matter where you were. So, I lost my train of thought. So anyway, okay, now I'm back. I went to Winberry's for supper one night, And I came home about 5:15 in the afternoon, and Richard lives on Prospect Street. And when I got on the road, all the street lights were on, and I could see 2 blocks down. Oh my God. There was all this light for 3 floors and all this noise, all this loud noise. And as I got up close, that's all I could hear was all this loud noise and people out on the balconies. He had balconies on the 2nd floor and balcony on the 3rd floor, and kids standing out on all these balconies. And I parked my car. It was like Animal House. You ever heard of Animal House? Well, there were 200 or 300 kids, 16 and 17 years old, in this house. And when I got in there, I'm on the 1st floor and I'm saying, Noah, Noah. And all I could smell, a horrible smell. I didn't know what marijuana smelled like. And all of a sudden, I knew what marijuana was. So then I couldn't find him on the 1st floor, so I went up to the 2nd floor and I opened up every door, and there were kids in every room. And then I couldn't find him on the 2nd floor. So I went up to the 3rd floor, which was his suite. He had the whole 3rd floor. And when I got up there, about 6 or 8 guys were up there with him, and they were over talking. And I said, Noah, I said, you've got hundreds of kids here that are 16 or 17 years old, and they're drinking, and they're smoking pot. And he said, oh yeah, my dad doesn't mind if I have friends over. I said, well, I'll tell you what, and I put my hands on my hips. I want them all out right now. I said, we cannot have this. I mean, I'm responsible for you, and if we get caught by the police, heaven only knows. So I want them out. He said, oh no, my dad doesn't mind. And then I stood there and I looked him in the eye, and I guess he got the word that I was really serious. So he went downstairs and he had a lot of them leave, but there were still 10 or 20. And I had been telling him for 20 minutes that they all had to leave. So finally I went to the land phone. We didn't have cell phones in '88. And so I called Richard on the only phone number that he had given me in Israel. And I called him on his land phone, and he answered in Israel. And so I told him, I said, Richard, you don't know the situation here. And so I told him, and he says, Ms. Nicolai, would you please let me speak to my son? So I got Noah, and he talked to Noah for a couple of minutes, and then Noah handed me back the phone, and he said, my son is having everyone leave our house, not his house, our house, and he will not have more than 2 people there at any one time till I get back. And I said, okay, thank you. And so Noah finally got rid of all the kids, and that was, I finally survived without a nervous breakdown. So that was my experience. In 2 weeks, boy, I had my place to live, and I had my job, and I was ready. Richard Falk is my hero. He is the one that really gave me the opportunity to move to Princeton, and he was my advisor. And he advised me on the peace caravans that we did. And he today is 91 years old, and this Jewish man is married to a Palestinian lady, and he has been a strong advocate for the freedom of the Palestinians. And he right now is living in Turkey, and he's a wonderful man. So I had joined St. Paul's Catholic Church on Main Street in Princeton, and I also had picked up a magazine, walking magazine, because I was already walking every morning through the university grounds, and I just loved it. So as I'm reading through the walking magazine, there was a big article about a peace walk that was going to be held across the United States, and that 215 Soviets were coming, and that they were going to walk across the United States from Washington to San Francisco with Americans. And any American who wanted to walk with them could go. And I thought, oh my God, I have to go on this. This will introduce me to international relations. So I wrote and got a brochure, and that's when I found out it was $2,500 to go as an American. And when I was singing in the choir there, one Sunday, I saw in the church bulletin in March that Martin Sheen was coming to Princeton. He was coming to the Aquinas Institute, and he was raising funds for the boys' home in Trenton. And being a very devout Catholic, that was one of his big projects, was to support this boys' home in Trenton. So it said the first 100 people that sign up to come to the Aquinas Institute gets to meet Martin Sheen. Well, that was the one peacemaker in the world I knew I had to meet. I thought, if I don't meet anybody, I have to know Martin Sheen. And so I thought, I will go. Well, and then I found out it costs $100 to go meet Martin Sheen. This was a $10,000 fundraiser, and every person paid $100 to go. So I told my 4 daughters that I was going to go to this meeting at the Aquinas Institute and meet Martin Sheen. And of course, my banker daughter, Brenda, puts her hands on her hips and says, "Mom, you're going to spend $100 meeting a man that might not do anything for you, and you're trying to save $2,500 to go on this peace walk? You better think twice." I said, "But they said we can meet him and we can talk to him." And so I said, "I'm going to ask him what he thinks." And Eileen said, "Mom, 100 people are going to be there. And if 100 people are there, you're not going to get to say 5 words to this man. You're just going to be able to say hello, goodbye, and that's it." So she said, "If you want to ask him anything, you better put it in writing." Well, man, thank God I have smart daughters that tell me what to do. Because I went ahead and I paid my $100, and I was to be one of the people at the Aquinas Institute, and I wrote my letter, and I put in it a brochure about the peace walk, and I told him about the 2 peace walks. One was from St. Petersburg to Moscow, and Americans were going there. And then the other one was from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco, and 215 Soviets were coming here. So of course I wanted to go on both of them. That would be a real experience. I'd never been to Russia yet. So I wrote this letter, and I didn't ask Martin Sheen for money. I asked him if he knew anybody that would help me. Same thing, but I tried to use diplomacy. So I was the first one at the Aquinas Institute that night. I was in the front row, right in front of the podium. I thought, I'm going to shake this man's hand, and I'm going to give him my letter. So now, this was in 1988. You don't have a cell phone. So I sat for an hour with no cell phone. And what do you do now without a cell phone when you're going to sit for 20 or 30 minutes? But I was in my glory, and time passed, and 100 people arrived, and Martin Sheen walks in. The priest had Martin Sheen come in with his wife, and he talked at the podium, and then the priest said, "Okay, now everybody can line up and meet Martin Sheen." So of course I was the 3rd one in line. 2 beat me, I don't know how they did. And I was the 3rd one, and I looked over my shoulder. There's 97 more people right behind me, and I thought, thank God Eileen told me to write this letter. When I got up to Martin Sheen, I shook his hand and I said, "Mr. Sheen, I have a letter. Would you be good enough to read it?" He said, "Absolutely." And he put it inside his inside pocket of his jacket. And I said, "Thank you so much." And the little tiny nun led me back out the way I came in, and I got to the parking lot, and I thought, well, there went my $100, and I hope he reads my letter. So I went home, and the next morning, Michael and I, my son Michael was with me at the time, and we went to work, and at noon, we came home for lunch. And I went to the kitchen to make lunch. And Michael went into the living room to check the answering machine. And he comes running out to the kitchen. "Mom, you gotta listen to the answering machine. Martin Sheen's on it." And I said, "Michael, don't you bother me about that $100 one more time. I know I spent the money on it. I don't care. I don't care." And he said, "Mom, go listen to your machine." So I ran in and I pushed the button and I hear, "Hello, Lois, this is Martin Sheen." He He said, I just want you to know I'm sponsoring that peace walk.
Yeah. Wow.
I couldn't believe it. He said, call me, I'm Brutus on Broadway. Just give me a call today. And he gave his number. So I called, expecting to get an answering machine or a secretary to answer. And Martin Sheen answers and says, hello. And so I said, oh, Mr. Sheen, this was wonderful. Are you gonna send me on both peace walks? And he said, now wait a minute. Tell me about these 2 peace walks. So I told him about it. And he says, you know you wanna go to Russia. But he said, I want you to do the American peace walk. He said, it's very important that there be Americans to introduce these Soviets to the American people as you go across the United States. So he said, I would be on that peace walk myself if I could. But he said, I'm sending you in my place. So he paid my $2,500, and I got to spend 5 weeks, 35 days with 215 Soviets from the 15 republics. And I made friends from Ukraine. My best friend was from Ukraine, Tamara Stripko. I still remember her name to this day. And there were each republic sent the number of people they could afford to send. So there were like 50 or 60 from Moscow, and there were 2 or 3 from Ukraine, and there were 2 I know from Kazakhstan. They were from, depended on which republic they were from. Without telling you the whole thing about it, it's in my book. And you can read it in my book. And let me see, which book would that be in? The first one's the nuclear disarmament. So this is in the 3rd book. It's the first story in the 3rd book, the new book. A brand new book that you could get today. So anyway, I want to tell you one story. We walked every day. 10 or 12 miles a day. We slept in tents, although many of the Soviets, most of the Soviets stayed in host homes. Every single night, they would be processed in local host homes. So many of them got to stay in homes, and they loved that. And so they would stay every night in a different host home. And then the hosts, of course, were so thrilled to have a Russian in their home. It was a Soviet, but they thought with all 15 republics were Russians, and they really aren't, they're Soviets. But anyway, they were so excited that every night they stayed in a different home for 6 or 7 nights. And then they couldn't stay in the home another night. They were so exhausted because these people would have a lavish dinner with all their neighbors, and then they would take them to Kmart and buy their kids all these clothes and tennis shoes and stuff. And so they'd be up till midnight, and then they'd have to get up at 6 to have a good breakfast. So they were losing sleep, and they were exhausted. After 5 or 6 days, they had to sleep in a tent so that they could get a good night's sleep. But it was a wonderful trip. And when we got to Iowa, Tom Harkin was the one senator in the United States that really supported the peace walk. And for 10 days we were in Iowa. He planned everything in every little town in Iowa. And one day he had us walking through the cornfields of Iowa because they were so proud of their corn in Iowa. And we were walking, hundreds of us, walking through with corn on both sides, and it was 101 degrees out. And all of a sudden we came to a tiny little area where there were some trees, and everybody wanted to sit under the trees. And I noticed that there was a little rinky-dink filling station over here, so I decided I had to go to the bathroom. And so I went over to this little filling station, and there's a little girl about 19 or 20 working in this filling station. And I said, oh, go across the street and meet the Russians. I'm walking with a lot of Russian people, you'll love it. And so I went into the bathroom. When I come out, she's standing there with her hands like this. I said, did you go over? She said, yes, I went over. She said, I walked all around and there's not a Russian over there. I said, what were you looking for, tails and horns? That just proves Americans had no idea. I took her across the street, and when the first Soviets opened up their mouth, the first Russians, and she said, oh my God, they are Russians. They look just like us. At that time, people didn't know it. That was just in the 80s, but that's the way it was. So Martin Sheen is my hero. He really did a lot to give me an opportunity. Then I met a man named Olja Suleimanov. Olja Suleimanov was a people's deputy in the Supreme Soviet. He was born in Kazakhstan, and he became a Supreme Soviet member in the Kremlin in Moscow. And he became Gorbachev's right-hand man for trying to stop nuclear testing. Because by then, when I met him in 1990, people were dying of radiation disease from all the radiation from the nuclear testing. They were dying here too, but over there it was really known. And so Oljas was trying to stop the nuclear testing. And so I met Olja Suleimanov because I went to Washington, D.C. with a friend of mine, Dolores Hewitt, who couldn't be here today, but she wrote in the book. And brain freeze. What did I just say? Olja Suleimanov. So anyway, okay. We were volunteering for Parliamentarians for Global Action in New York City. And Aaron Tavish, who was the director, asked me if I wanted to go to Washington, D.C. to help them for 3 days with a tripartite delegation for nuclear disarmament. So Dolores went with me, and we went to Washington, D.C., and soon after we got there, somebody came in and said, oh my God, we need someone to drive to the airport to pick up the Soviet delegate and the British delegate for nuclear disarmament, and I volunteered. And so I was at Dulles Airport in Washington when Oljas walked through the double doors. And this little black-haired man who became my wonderful hero is a wonderful, wonderful man. Today he's 85. He closed the nuclear test site in Semipalatinsk in the Soviet Union, and he helped us close our American test site because I was out jogging one day and I came home and my phone was ringing. So I ran to the phone because you only had land phones, and this was in 91 or 92. And I ran and I grabbed the phone and I said, hello? And there was a little bit of a wait, and then, hello, may I speak to Miss Lois Nicolai? And I said, well, this is Lois. This is the Kremlin operator calling. One moment, please. And I thought, who is pulling this on me? The Kremlin wouldn't be calling me. So I almost hung up, but I thought, I gotta see who's doing this. And all of a sudden, Vladimir gets on the phone. Hello, Lois, this is Vladimir Iakovitz. I met you in Washington, D.C. when you were there, and I'm calling for Oljas, and I'm calling from the Kremlin, and I have to make it short. He said, Oljas wants to know if you're going to the big meeting in Nevada in April, around the middle of April. And I said, well, I don't know anything about that meeting yet. I'll probably find out about it. He said, well, Oljas wants to send 7 Kazakhs and me, him, Vladimir, who's a translator. And he said, he wants the 8 of us to go to the Nevada nuclear test site for those 3 days for this big rally to stop nuclear testing. So he said, what he would like to ask is if we fly to New York, will you pick us up and take us to Nevada to the nuclear test site for 3 days? And I'm standing there thinking, I'm going to take 8 people across the United States, 3,000 miles, and I don't have $20 in my checking account. I pay my rent by the month. I don't have any. And this was before we had World Citizen Diplomats as a 501c3, so we didn't have any grants or anything. And I'm thinking, how the hell am I ever going to take 8 people across the United States? But then I'm thinking, oh, this is Olja Suleimanov. This is a people's deputy in the Supreme Soviet in the Kremlin. How can I tell him no? And I said, well, I guess I can. And I didn't know how, I don't know how I ever said it. But I told him, he said, oh, that would be wonderful, and I'll talk to you later. And I thought, oh my God, how am I going to take 8 people across the United States and I don't have any funds? So thank God I had been on that peace caravan in 88, in that Soviet American Peace Walk, because I had learned what hosts were all about. And what moving from one town and having host families in those towns, because that's where the Soviets were staying. In a lot of cases, they didn't stay in their tents, they stayed. So I thought, okay, so I laid my American map out of the United States, and I started figuring I can drive 600 miles to Indianapolis in 12 hours, and I can drive here, and I can drive here, and I figured out how I was gonna do it, and then I contacted each city, and I found hosts that would host us. And of course, when I told them that people from Kazakhstan were coming and Russia, and they did, this was all brand new to everybody, so they all were happy to host us. And do you know, we made a 30-day trip around the United States from New Jersey all the way, and spent 3 days with Daniel Ellsberg and the Berrigan brothers and Kaysen was the MC.
Casey.
What is his name?
Casey.
Yes. Casey Kasem. He was the MC. So we spent 3 days there. Then we went on to Los Angeles. And my daughter was living in Oceanside, right near Los Angeles. So we visited, and she hosted us for a night, and then we went from Los Angeles to San Francisco for a big meeting at the a big place, Lawrence Livermore Labs, outside of San Francisco, where they did testing and all. And so for 30 days we traveled. Now, when we were at Lawrence Livermore Labs, CNN and all the newspapers were there because the Berrigan brothers were there, and Daniel Ellsberg was there, all these famous people. And so they drew them, but then when they found out that Kadimbek Kuyakov was there. Now, Olja sent Kadimbek Kuyakov, and I want you to close your eyes and picture what it would be like to grow up with no arms. No arms. Not a stump. Not a stump. They stop here. So all you have is shoulders. No hands and no arms. And today that man is 51 years old and a grandfather. And when he was born with no arms because of radiation disease, his parents kept him alive till he learned to feed himself with his toes. He would put a spoon in his toes and fed himself. And he learned to paint with a paintbrush in his teeth. And he's very famous. If you pull Kadimbek Kuyakov up on your computer, he's a very famous painter today, an artist. And Kadimbek Kuyakov came, and his sister Soleil came with him so that she could take care of him, because you have to have help. I mean, how do you do a lot of things for yourself when you don't have any hands at all? I mean, I just can't imagine going through life without hands. And when the COVID hit and so many people died, I read some of his emails were so sad, because he was hit hard with the COVID, worrying about everybody dying from the COVID, but that's beside the point. Anyway, he traveled with me the whole 30 days. He was one of the 8 people. So when we were in California and CNN covered it, everybody in the United States and abroad knew about Kadimbek Kuyakov and about some of the other people that were with me. When we got back to Nevada, because we went back after we were in California, we went back to Nevada. I called my son, Michael, and Barbara Rash, because they were taking care of my apartment, And they were checking my voicemail on my phone because I had no cell phone. And I had no way, so I had to call them on a payphone. And when I called them, Mike says, "Mom, guess what? We just checked your messages, and McNeil Air News Hour just called on your machine and said they want to interview Kadibek Kuyakov and Roland Saisambayev and several of the people that are with you. So they want to set up an appointment." And I said, "Oh my God, we're getting back and we're only going to be there 3 days before they fly back to Russia." So I said, "You'll have to set it up." And I told him when I thought we'd be in. And Michael set it up for the day we got into the East Coast. We went straight to New York City, and by the Central Park is a hotel, and that's where we met with McNeil Air News Hour. And they interviewed Kadimbeck and Roland Saisambayev and Vladimir for an hour. We were recording. They were recording. 2 months later, that segment showed on World News. CNN put it on, or McNeil Air News Hour put it on World News. And 2 days later, the American nuclear test site was closed. So and everybody were a big part of getting that nuclear test site closed. So that is remarkable. Now I have a wonderful, in 1996, I met my next hero. And my next hero was LifeBridge Foundation. And LifeBridge Foundation, we became a 501c3 nonprofit status in 93 or 94. But we were paying for everything out of our pockets. And I mean, it was not easy. So finally we decided to look for a foundation in 95 or early 96. I was looking for a foundation. And the first foundation I found that looked like maybe they would hear us, they responded and said, "Come to New York." And so Professor Dietrich Fischer and I got on a train and went to New York City, and we went to the office of LifeBridge Foundation, and Barbara Overby, who's sitting in the front row, who happens to be the president of LifeBridge Foundation, and she and her father are the founders of LifeBridge Foundation. She and Larry Auld greeted us that day, and we sat on a couch, Dietrich and I, and the two of them were in two chairs, and we spent 2 hours with them, told them everything World Citizen Diplomats had been doing since '88, and what we wanted to do with the peace caravans through Canada and Europe, and that we needed funding. And do you know, without going into big detail, LifeBridge Foundation became our grantor. They granted us 4 grants in 96, 97, 98, and 99. They funded our trip so that we could go to Costa Rica and hold a big 3-day seminar in Costa Rica. They funded our peace caravan through Canada. They funded for Wahid to be able to go in 98 on the second peace caravan. He didn't have the funds to get here, so it was that grant that helped get him here, and we did the whole peace caravan through Europe and Scandinavia, and then it funded in 1999 for Rosie and I to go to the Hague Appeal for Peace, where there was a big 1-week conference with 10,000 people there from all over the world. And in 1999, that was the 100th celebration of the first World Conference, Peace Conference, when in 1899 was the first one, and this was the second one, the very big one. And every one of those 10,000 people at that conference thought sure peace was on its way in the new millennium. So the World Trade Center going down really destroyed all of us because we thought this was the new millennium that would be peace for the whole world. So I have no one that I can thank more, or that is not more of a hero to me than Barbara, and I'm gonna ask
Oh, Lois.
Yes.
I have my tissue already.